CMMS Radio talks about all things CMMS, computerized maintenance management software, focused on maintenance management. It's the people, the process, and the culture that make your CMMS journey a success. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we've got a returning guest, a bona fide expert. It's Erik Hupje. He's with Reliability Academy, and what they're there to do is get you on the road to reliability. Before we get into these random topics around maintenance and CMMS, I want to give a quick shout out to Metallica and All Within My Hands Foundation. This weekend, they had an amazing benefit concert up in Inglewood at the YouTube Theater. I just wanted to give a quick shout out. Also, another shout out to Mike Franz at Shop Floor Coffee. Finally got to meet him at that concert, and it was off the charts. More on that later. Erik, welcome back to CMMS Radio.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be back. I always enjoy our conversations.
Me too. And the best thing about it for me is that I get to ask questions that in a lot of cases I don't really know the answers to. I might have some ideas and some clues, but I get to lean on you to help anybody, even if it's just one person that listens to CMMS Radio, to improve their overall experience, whether it's CMMS or just maintenance management related. So thank you for that.
No worries. We'll do our best. Just don't make them too hard.
I won't, but we're going to start out with a listener, friend of CMMS Radio, friend of mine, and friend of yours submitted question. That was a lot to say. It's from the one and only Brian Bieski, and he asks, why is it that planning and scheduling, pound for pound, is the most revolutionizing process in maintenance, but no one does it or rarely scratches the surface?
Right. So there's two questions in there, I guess. One, why is it so powerful? And two, why don't we do it that well? So in terms of why it's such a good process, such an impactful process, is it basically organizes your execution, right? So when it comes to maintenance, ultimately everything we do, all the development of preventive maintenance programs, the buying of a CMS, everything else comes together when we execute our maintenance, right? And so to execute maintenance, we need to have the job plan ready, we need to have the materials ready, we need to have the labor ready, we need to have the equipment shut down and isolated and everything else, external resources, access. There's a lot of things that need to come together. And that is what planning and scheduling basically does for you if you do it well. So basically the planning piece is really the work preparation piece. That's already identifying, okay, what needs to be done? What's the sequence of steps? What do we need to do it? Resources, materials, everything else. When does it need to be there? All the different steps. And then the scheduling piece is making sure that all that is done, not just for one job, but for all the jobs in your week and everything else. So when you do that consistently, you really get a productive maintenance crew, then first of all, they are going to get a lot more work done, but they also typically are in a much less reactive mode, because they're actually getting the work done. You're not piled under heaps of work that you can't get done because you're not very effective and efficient. So it's a very, very powerful process to really drive productivity in the maintenance crew, which is essential to get the work done and make sure you stay on top of it. The reason it's actually really, I'm not 100% sure why we're so bad at it. Well, so bad. Why it is so hard for so many organizations to not do this well. I've now been working with quite a few organizations. I've worked in many places around the world myself, and planning and scheduling is very often not done that well. And I think there's a few things. One is, it's one of those processes that is actually quite simple, but because it requires a large number of people to play their part in it, you need all the technicians to cooperate, you need your operators to coordinate, to work with it, you need to have planners and schedulers and supervisors and everything else, and you need to do it through a CMS and etc. There's quite a few moving pieces. And I think that makes it much harder than other processes because there's a lot of people involved, right? You need to get everybody moving and applying the same process. I think the second thing is it's a process that is not taught anywhere other than if you do like dedicated training courses, but nobody learns planning and scheduling anywhere other than in practice. And so this is what you see a lot happening. People basically become a planner or a scheduler or a supervisor or a maintenance manager, and they learn on the job how planning and scheduling should be done. And very often they don't learn it the right way because, they learn what they learn based on what the organization is doing. Another big problem is that a lot of organizations confuse planning with scheduling. So if you ask a typical person, show me a plan, what do you get? You get a Gantt chart, which really is a schedule, right? Planning is that's why I used the word work preparing earlier. Planning is preparing work so you can execute it efficiently. And if you look at most planners in organizations, they're busy and they'll be doing some planning, but they often get lumped with a lot of other stuff, right? Because typically planners are people who know the plan quite well. They know the CMS, they know how to get parts and everything else. And before you know it, they're being asked by everybody left, right, and center in the organization to help them with this. Can you get the parts for this? How do we do that? This, that, and the other. And they get stuck in supporting the execution team day to day, and they're actually not planning that much. So planning as a concept is not well understood. The planner role is often undermined because people ask the planners to do way more than they should be doing. And I think, but probably the biggest thing is that organizations really don't understand how a good planning and scheduling process should look like, how it should work, and how to measure that, and also then how to implement it, because that's the other thing. I've seen with a few clients over the years is when we train their team, they understand what now needs to happen, but then making that happen in an organization is a second step, because you're impacting so many different people. It's not like you're training 2 or 3 engineers who just go off and do it. You're basically getting a whole group of people trying to work in a different process, which is not as easy as people think.
It sure seems to me like, everybody, like when you're in those meeting rooms and those training rooms and we're talking about all this and everybody's kind of buying in, a little bit less resistant, or maybe they're leaving their resistance at the door so that we can understand how are we all going to do this. And then when you leave that meeting, you leave those training or workshop sessions and you get into the plant environment or whatever your environment is where you practice maintenance, and it just gets lost in all the noise, like what you're saying. And I don't know what the real solution is other than bringing it in earlier, making it a part of maybe even the onboarding process, some regular reinforcement with, are we looking at this and are we doing what we started doing 6 months ago? I just think, like you said, there's so many moving parts and so many changes. Somebody's out today, somebody leaves the company, the champion of this whole process has left or leveled up, and now somebody else has to take over. Is there a general methodology that could get somebody kind of started on this path, or is that where that risk you talked about, where they start incorporating what they're seeing, what they're learning that's already in place, kind of muddies the waters?
So there's definitely a framework or an approach to do this, right? So maybe a couple other comments before we talk about that. One thing you touched on very early on, what you just mentioned is, people come to training, they go through the training, they get to understand it. They might indeed go like, hey, yeah, actually that makes sense. We should be doing that. And then they go back to work, right? They spend 2 or 3 days in training, they go back to work, and it's back to the chaos. And very quickly, it's like, all right, those binders I'm planning is changing. I've got to push them to the side because I'm busy now. I've got to get stuff done. And eventually they go off the desk into your cupboard under your desk, and then they go into the archive. And, that's how often it happens with these training. And this is one of the reasons actually why we have set up our training slightly different than many others. All our training is basically aimed at being done online over a longer period of time whilst people work. So they will study 1 or 2 or 3 hours per week, maybe 5 hours per week, depending on the pace they're going through. They do assignments, they do reflections on how things currently work, and they actually complete the training over a period of 6 to 10 weeks. It's slower, yes, but the knowledge retention is much higher. And because as they're doing it, they're reflecting on what they're doing on the work. They're doing assignments where they say, hey, this is how you're supposed to do prioritization. Analyze how you're doing in your work. What are you doing well? What are you not doing well? The knowledge retention tends to be much higher. And this is why we picked for that delivery mode. And then often we supplement it with some live Q&A sessions to make sure that people have the engagement that they need. So that's an important part in terms of just getting the knowledge retention piece solved. Then in terms of implementing, one of the things we do in one version of our training course, we actually teach an implementation framework. That's a framework I learned, 20 years ago or so, when I worked for a large oil and gas multinational, and we were rolling out planning and scheduling across the globe, basically, and I implemented it in a few assets. And it's a framework. They developed, but to be honest, they took it from a consultancy that was specialized in change management, and they added in bits and pieces around planning and changing. And what I've now done is I've taken that framework that I learned myself, simplified it a bit, because it's like with these big multinationals, they make things a little bit complicated. So we simplified, and that's the implementation framework we teach in our training courses. And so it's quite simple. It's almost like a recipe book. You go through 6 phases, and at the end of each phase, there's a number of things that you need to have done. You check that those are done, that they're done well, properly, and then you go to the next phase. Now, interestingly enough, we teach that to our students, and we've had once or twice clients in the past say, Erik, I just wish we'd done what you taught us. Because in the course, you tell us what we need to do, this, and this, that we need to do these kind of things. We need to identify stakeholders. We need to do this. We need to do that. But we chose not to do them because we just wanted to get on with it. And then, 6, 12, 18 months down the line, they look back and say, we made a good start, but it all fell apart because it wasn't sustainable. So that's actually one of the reasons we now have, we're developing a solution where actually we don't just train people in the knowledge and in the implementation process. We actually have now a process where we can add a coach for 12 months to help them stick to the implementation process. So it's still very much that the organizations do it themselves, but they're being guided through the implementation framework. Because the thing is, people who roll out who implement planning and scheduling in their organization typically only will do it once, maybe twice in their career, right? Mm-hmm. When you do things the first time, you're bound to make mistakes, right? Because you don't know, and you think you might know better or whatever. But by adding a coach who's been there, done that kind of, we can basically guide these organizations to say, hey, if you want to roll this out, this is how you should do it. This is good practice. And that really helps. That's really a good way of doing it.
I like the idea you have there of adding in the coach, because when we experience these particular changes in our respective environments, whatever they might be, that can kind of act as a stopgap. And I talk about this like from the CMMS perspective. I think a lot of providers of CMMS solutions want to have readily available people on their front lines to help their clientele when they experience changes or they want to reassess where they're at and kind of stay on course. But it's hard to deliver that. So I like you adding that into the coursework so that someone can not only go down this path, implement these methodologies to planning and scheduling, but then they've got a constant resource so they don't have to go ask a colleague or have as much of a detriment to what that project is looking like. If somebody leaves, they can go back to their coach. It's an interesting thing that you're adding in there. I want to switch gears, and we're going to move away from Brian's question. Sorry, Brian. RCM, reliability centered maintenance. I wanted to ask if there's a way to, just in a nutshell, tell us what that is. Because I've had a lot of people ask, could you ask one of your experts just a really simple definition of what RCM is and how it relates to the CMMS?
Right. Okay. So first things first, let me be a disclaimer. I'm not an RCM expert. There's people in industry, and you probably know, like Nancy Regan. There are people who are real experts in RCM. But I've worked with RCM long enough to understand how to use it, when to use it, etc., and when not to use it, and when to engage an expert, right? But in simple terms, RCM is a methodology to develop a preventive maintenance program, right? So basically, it looks at how your plant, your equipment can fail from a functional perspective. It identifies the core functions of your piece of equipment and then says, right, how can that equipment or that asset fail to meet those functions? And then you start analyzing those. It's a very thorough process. You look at the functions, you look at how those functions can fail, you look at then the consequences within the operating context, and then you decide, okay, what do I need to do about that? And then there's one of the powerful things also is there's a decision logic to guide you to make sure you take the right technical decision. You don't apply the wrong type of maintenance for that. So it's a methodology to derive a preventive maintenance plan. It is something you can use on an existing asset that is running. You can use it in the design phase. And in fact, you should be ideally using it in the design phase very early on so you can actually influence the design. You go like, hold on, If we do it like that, we're going to have a pretty bad maintenance outcome. It would be way better if we change the design to this, this, and this, and we reduce the maintenance burdens. That is how the airline industry have approached that, and how they achieve such phenomenal outcomes is because they do this very early in their life cycle, right? So in simple terms, it's a methodology to develop an effective and efficient preventive maintenance program. And then in terms of the role with the CMS, well, ultimately that maintenance needs to be executed, right? So you then take the outcome of your RCM analysis, which tells you which tasks you need to do. You then scope those tasks into job plans, and that then goes into your CMS so they come out at the right time and the right frequency with the tools, parts, and materials you need, etc.
And now we can see, track, and of course manage what has been done, what the results were, how it's looking. Are we getting those improvements? Do we have more availability? On and on like this. So that's and the reason I wanted to ask you is you've been in so many environments, you've dealt with so many different types of clientele that yes, they're performing maintenance, but maintenance in and of itself changes a lot environment by environment by environment. It has a lot to do with the culture and the different things that are happening at a given organization. So I want to switch gears now and see if you're willing to help me pick on AI a little bit. So this idea of artificial intelligence, and I'm certainly no expert. Some of my friends are. I like to pick on it because I have this huge fear that it's too much of an easy button. It's too much of a, hey, this is going to do so much for you, when in fact it's something else. So anything you could tell us about, AI, where you have concerns, and also where you're excited, where you think it has applicability. And we'll agree, just for purposes of the question here on this episode, that AI is actually machine learning. It's programmatic in nature. It's not really what it seems like it is. That's my opinion.
Yeah. So look, I'm no expert either. I am a user. We use it in my company where we can to make things more efficient and more effective. In terms of where you could apply it into, within the maintenance reliability space, I think it has a number of great opportunities and potentials, but we need to realize, I think, what it currently is and what it currently isn't. So let me maybe share just a couple of things I've tried and kind of the feedback I've gotten from that, or the assessment. So, I've used a couple of the AI models, ChatGPT and others, and asked them, technical questions. I've asked them to, assist with reviewing or analyzing a failure modes analysis, or identifying failure modes for specific types of equipment. Mediocre result. It comes up with interesting things as in a good prompt, but you wouldn't be able to trust it. And here's the thing, right? The AI, these large language models are fed with everything we've known. They basically scanned everything in the books we've ever written over humanity, over time in humanity and the internet, right? So they've got all that. But if you're really honest, when it comes to maintenance reliability, there's a lot of mediocre content. Let's say that way. A lot of mediocre content out there, right? So you would probably have to train those models really rigorously to make sure that they only rely to high quality content and forget all the mediocre content. And I'm sure that's possible, but I haven't done it, and I haven't come across somebody who's really done it just yet. So I think in terms of expert analysis, that could become the future, but somebody would have to train them. Right, and you have to train them with good content. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Interestingly enough, I know that there's a large oil and gas company in Australia who's been using AI initially through the IBM Watson solution, and now others, to analyze the feedback, the technical feedback, the job history that was written down by technicians over the years, and using AI to extract insight from that. Because often what happens is, you might get 2 or 3 sentences, but it's like, okay, well, what failure mode was that really, right? And the way you typically end up then analyzing that is having reliability engineers read through thousands of lines of feedback and trying to code that. Well, AI can do that, and can do that very fast, especially if you have a lot of text. It won't be perfect, but it can do that pretty good. So, that is, I think, an area where it can be very viable. Obviously, AI has huge opportunities in analyzing data, historical data, process data, all those kind of things, right? So it will make condition monitoring, and I'm not going to use predictive maintenance just yet, but the condition monitoring, the advanced condition monitoring, performance monitoring, really a lot more robust and powerful. But I think from what I can see so far, the limitation is very much around that it relies on what it's been fed, and you've got to be very, very careful with, especially you just using, Chat GPT generically and getting value from that. But I think there's huge potential in the future, and a lot of people have already said that. It's a famous, well, not famous yet, but it will be famous soon. The quote that AI won't take your job, but a person using AI will, and I think that's how I see it. Right. I don't see AI replacing reliability engineers just yet, but it will replace certain tasks of reliability engineers, right? So it will do the data analysis much faster. Might probably do the data analysis and plot the graphs. It will basically analyze your historical text in your CMS. It can probably Pareto a lot of data in your CMS. But we all know that a lot of the data going in the CMS is not always great quality, right? So you need to do some cleaning up. It might be able to help with those kind of things, but I still think it will still need a lot of human guidance and intervention. But I think it has huge potential.
I tend to agree, and I think when I take that approach where I want to pick on AI and kind of make fun of it, that's not really my goal. It's more about what's really happening out here. Be careful of magic shiny silver bullets and all that stuff, easy buttons, because we want that. We can use that, but we want to be really careful to the unsuspecting. You have a lot of younger up and comers in the space that know and understand how to use certain, types of technology, their phones, etc. And we just want to make sure that it's being done right. And at some point, someone's going to leverage it to make sure it's being done right. And that'll take time. It won't happen overnight. So the possibilities are endless. I'm just always kind of, hey, let's be really, really careful. And that's why I wanted to ask you, because I love getting a different opinion when it's someone like you that's on the podcast. So here's one for you. I have a statement for you to respond to. And no wrong answers here. So please respond to this statement. That will never work here.
I just responded to that statement this morning on LinkedIn. Yeah. It's a very common statement, isn't it? It's one of the most common objectives you hear is say, oh, yeah, that will never work here. And my view is that usually, well, there's a couple things behind that, but in at a high level, what you need to show people who say that, or organizations who feel that, is that they're not as special as they think they are. They're not as unique. I think most people who've worked in many different companies or with different companies will realize that a lot of companies in this space struggle with very similar issues. A lot of companies have pretty poor, ineffective, inefficient PM programs. A lot of companies have pretty poor planning and scheduling processes. And if you start analyzing, very often there's a similar kind of flaws that are there and that need to be addressed. So the thing, though, is that when people say that will never work here, you counter that with say, look, you're not as special as you think you are, but at the same time, you can't just dismiss that, right? That statement is this form of resistance that you need to overcome, and you need to get people to basically understand why it can happen there. And I think one of the good things also there is that, being able to show case studies and examples of similar companies who have done what they're looking to do and say, well, look, if they can do it, why wouldn't you be able to do that?
Yeah. And the first thing that pops into my head when you say that is Toyota. When we well, I think it's a prime example of how a lot of these things that we and people we know in common would love to see for anybody and everybody where it's applicable, of course. I mean, not all organizations should be necessarily striving for that when it comes, we all want continual process improvement. However, there's a cost, there's a certain intention behind it, and you some things, however you're doing it, that's the best it's going to be, and for you to try to improve it might not be the wisest decision from maybe a profit perspective, as long as you have the quality, the safety, and the outcomes that you want. So it was just an interesting thing that popped into my head. I'm always thinking about how Toyota does it so well, and that it's something that everyone wants to emulate, and maybe not everyone should, but I like the way you kind of handled that one. And I knew you would. That's why I wanted to ask it. Because again, this isn't necessarily for me only, but it's for other people that might hear it, but I get to learn too and get some of your perspective. Do you think when it comes to 2025 and how we're turning from this year to next year, that most of the focus in the overall maintenance and reliability space is going to be on those newer technologies and like AI? Or do you think there might be more of a, let's not forget to keep talking about what we've always been talking about, the basics, the basic elements, the fundamental excellence that's required for any of this to work in the first place?
Yeah, I think realistically it will be more of what we've seen in the past. So there'll be a lot of talk about the shiny objects, and that is currently AI. So there'll be heaps and heaps of noise around AI and machine learning, and of course there is a lot of progress in everything else. So I think that will steal a lot of the limelight. But then when you read some of the industry reports, there've been a couple of interesting reports that come out in like the last 6 months. When you analyze those, you actually see the feedback from a few hundred maintenance managers in one of those reports, and planning and scheduling and work management came out as their single biggest pain point. And I go like, wow, I didn't expect that it would be coming out of that survey. It was a few hundred maintenance managers worldwide, and they came out that was their single biggest pain point. So I think what we'll see is we'll still see a lot of talk around the shiny objects, the high level things, predictive maintenance solutions, software technology, AI, and everything else. But it will not have changed. We will still be experiencing the fundamentals where we're lacking, whether that's planning and scheduling or ineffective PM programs, or organizations that struggle with doing the basics of maintenance, right? Precision maintenance practices, those kind of things. And my opinion very much is that you need to get those things in place first before you start to look at adopting these kind of more advanced practices.
Interesting that you say that, because so often we see the push forward when those other things aren't quite in place, and maybe even much earlier than that. And that just creates more of a, I'm going to say mess, maybe it's not the most professional term, but more of a mess when it comes to, well, we never really did that. Now we're going to go back and do that. That's an immense undertaking, because now you've got so many processes that have to be unpacked or unlearned, and you need to affect behavioral change so that people are staying on task with what's going to actually give us the outcomes that we want. So it's really interesting that you point that out. I think the same. I wanted to switch then to what are, maybe kind of succinctly, what are the dangers of the blame game in maintenance departments and organizations?
At the extreme extent, death and bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. That's a bit flippant, but the blame game is so it undermines everything, right? So if you have an environment where people are blamed for things going wrong, right? Individuals singled out for their specific mistakes, you've basically created a culture where you're not learning, because that's what that is, right? An organization has a blame culture is basically a culture that hasn't adopted kind of a learning culture, and understands that the vast majority of things that go wrong are not the result of an individual mistake, but there's an underlying systemic cause that has caused that individual to make that mistake. Sure, there are instances where an individual does something and you can say, hey, did that individual do that for personal gain, right? A shortcut that make their life easier. Would somebody else have done that, etc.? There's this model called the just culture model where you look at, okay, if somebody's done something wrong, why did they do it, and act accordingly. But in the vast majority of cases, people make a mistake either because they didn't know better, they weren't trained, it was unclear what they had to do, the documentation was there, or they did it in the best interest of the company, right? They think they were doing the right thing. Usually it's a minority of cases where people deliberately do something wrong because it's in their personal interest. If that happens, right, you have a conversation, and you do consequence management, and if it's really bad, you get rid of the individual. But what's happening with blame is that people get blamed for things that really aren't their fault. All right. And what that does is everybody will basically, A, stop speaking up. B, you won't actually address the underlying causes, so you will never get any better at what you are. And C, chances are, as soon as somebody sees a better job somewhere else, they'll be off. So it's a terrible way of running a business, and it's guaranteed to keep you where you are and progressively continue to slide down the slope.
Interesting. I was recently, I was meeting with Bob Latino, Prelical Solutions, and we touched on this a little bit. And I think a lot of the practitioners that I talk to, we touch on this often, or I read things from them, or I hear something where they might have been on a podcast, whatever it might be, where this environment we're really looking for in organizations and maintenance environments around being able to speak plainly and not have so much fear of reprisal when you want to call something out. And at the same time, we can't just go scorched earth on somebody. We've got to have kind of a healthy way of bringing up what happened, but avoiding that blame game is right away a step forward, because you're now looking for solutions. And it's not that causation isn't important, but you're looking for solutions and progress. How can we improve, as opposed to singling out, like you said? And I don't think we're going to resolve it in, one discussion about it. I think we have to keep talking about it. So my next question is, if you could only say one thing louder, only one thing, what would it be?
Focus on the basics, do the basics well, and the rest will follow eventually.
Nice.
Very simple. And just to be clear, those basics, in my view, are the core processes of planning and scheduling, a good preventive maintenance program, defect elimination. You underpin that with leadership and culture. Those are the four things. If you focus on those, you get a really good thing. And then from there, you can focus, okay, what else needs to come? People always ask me, but what about precision maintenance? What about this? What about that? I says, well, yeah, but you focus on those things after you figured out what really matters for you. I've seen organizations focus on advanced lubrication or thermography or whatever practices because they got excited about that. But actually, it's not their main pain point. Yeah, they have assets that need lubricating, but actually, that's not what's causing their biggest pain. So why go and invest in that at this point when you've so focus on the basics, focus on those core processes, understand where your pain points are, and then address those.
Those core processes that you just described, and I had a note for self. I was going to say, can we close out with a brief on the road to reliability framework with you naming each element and their respective impact? And you just did it without me even asking. So that's a beautiful thing. That means we were on the right track. And this conversation, as they always are, Erik, is highly productive. For everyone out there, Erik Hupje, Reliability Academy. You can visit reliabilityacademy.com. That way you can learn more, and you can find this man on LinkedIn. It's Erik, E-R-I-K, and it's Hupje, H-U-P-J-E. Erik, thank you once again for being on with me here. CMMS
Thank you,
Radio.
Greg. Yeah, thank you very much. Great having you here. Always a great conversation. So thank you very much.
Of course. Did you find this episode helpful? Please send us some feedback, suggest a topic, or ask a question. Reach out to CMMS Radio if you need a co-pilot on your CMMS project. Visit CMMSradio.com and use the What's on Your Mind link. Thank you for tuning in to CMMS Radio, your resource for all things CMMS, from selection to implementation, to help you make better choices, learn from industry experts, and have a successful CMMS journey.